Hello, everyone. This is Christian Massar again with another episode of the podcast. So, what I want to do today is comparing Plato and Kant. So, some of the great philosophers in Western culture. So, what I'm going to do is compare them and look at how did they think about ethics. So, I'll be comparing some of their points. So, ancient Greek philosopher Plato and Prussian thinker, not Russian, Prussian thinker Emmanuel Kant, which is kind of interesting because Emmanuel Kant was born in Kaliningrad, and now it is part of Russia. But anyway, when he was born, it was part of Prussia. So both Plato and Kant pondered the definition of morality. What makes a good person, or his or her actions, moral or, quote, just? Asked another way, how ought we to decide what is right and wrong human conduct, quote unquote? Without engaging in criticism of their views, so this is not a value judgment, we will summarize these two philosophers' answers to this question. First, we will analyze the steps they took in order to arrive at their conclusions. We will also look briefly at some assumptions that Plato and Kant made, but did not necessarily state in their arguments. Finally, we will categorize them into one of three ethical types: deontological, virtue, or utilitarian. We will start with Plato, referring to his works The Republic and the Euthyphro, both of which he wrote in the voice of his tutor Socrates. According to him, a just person is virtuous and wise, while the unjust are ignorant and immoral. Opposing his views in the Republic is Thrasymachus, who views, quote, unjust people, especially those in power, as being, quote, clever and good. Being unjust is advantageous, according to Thrasymachus. And again, Thrasymachus? I'm not sure. I definitely don't speak Greek, and I think you can tell. Plato, again through Socrates' voice, counters that unjust people stir up hatred against themselves. Instead of working for each other's advantage, immoral people will make enemies of just people and each other. Quote, what if hatred due to unjust behavior arises between two people? Won't they be at odds, Plato asks, hate each other and be enemies to one another and to just people? End quote. Of course, here Plato assumes that unjust people will always be at each other's throats. So, unjust people or evil people aren't always against each other. They sometimes work with each other, and good people don't always work with each other either. Sometimes good people can be against each other. So, but again, enough with value judgments, Christian. To conclude the matter, Plato states that just people are wise and not only virtuous, but happy. Justice is, quote, among the finest kinds of good, end quote. It is inherently good, justice, and brings good results to just people. But what does Plato say makes a, quote, just person? Oliver Johnson and Andrews Reith say the following in their commentary on the Republic. And this is from their book, Ethics, Selections from Classical and Contemporary Writers. They say this about Socrates. Socrates, yet again, this is the voice Plato uses, argues that the city as a whole will be just when each citizen performs his or her own task well and does not interfere with the tasks of others. Socrates' larger point is that a just city is one in which harmonious internal relations exist between the different classes of citizens. End quote. Life in a just city is harmonious, just like how Plato says that just people are happy. Such a city is quote, thought to be moderate, courageous, and wise. The peoples of each class, quote, mind their own business. In addition, Plato refers to the usefulness of human organs. Just like a good eyeball allows one to see, a good soul has a good function. Conversely, a bad or unjust soul, just like a bad eye or a spine, causes pain and other bad results. A third image that Plato uses to define justice is the soul, or specifically the parts of one's soul. He divides one's soul into two main parts, the, quote, reasoning and, quote, hungering or lusting sections. A soul's rational part masters the rest through self-control and discipline. Using this image of a multifaceted soul, Plato defines justice thus, quote, one who is just does not allow any part of himself to do the work of another part or allow the various classes within him to meddle with each other, end quote. A just person thus harmonizes the different aspects of his being, like a musician making a pleasant melody. Just actions keep intact this inner harmony. Unjust actions disrupt this harmony, making a person submissive to nature, not just moral reason. So in this, I kind of see a comparison almost to, I shouldn't make the comparison too direct or too certain, but it seems to be some kind of a similarity or a parallel to some Eastern thinking, right? So like we have to follow this certain path, and then anything that we do that's bad disrupts that, right? So I see a little bit of similarity there. Not saying that Plato and speaking for Socrates, is making those connections between West and East. He likely wasn't aware of Buddhist teaching or anything like that, or Taoist teachings, but I do notice a kind of a parallel there in that. But that's as far as I want to go with those parallels. I don't think it's even that strong, but it's an interesting one that I see. So what about the divine? In the Euthyphro, Plato writes about a debate between Socrates and Euthyphro regarding piety versus impiety. Euthyphro defines pious acts as those that please the gods, for example, punishing criminals. Impious acts anger the gods. Socrates explains why the gods like pious actions. He says that they love pious actions because the actions are pious, and the actions are not pious because the gods they are not pious, rather, because just because the gods love those behaviors. Right? So in other words, Socrates, and thus Plato, says that pious actions are inherently pious or good. The gods' opinions about those actions do not make them good. The standard for right action or justice is absolute, but without regard for the gods' authority. Right? So this advocates an absolute morality, but without appeal to divine law. So when Christians and Muslims and other religious people make the argument for absolute righteousness or the absolute truth, they usually point to a divine figure. Christians will point to God, so Father, Son, Holy Spirit, while Muslims may point to Allah, right, or the word of the Quran. So, but here Socrates is saying that good actions are good just because they're good, and not referring to the God's laws, right? So it's an interesting difference. He arrives at the same point, but he arrives at a different source of that absolute truth, or that point of absoluteness. To further this point, Socrates tells Euthyphro that the Greek gods often hated and fought against each other, a fact often shown in Greek myths. Remember how Plato in the Republic argues that unjust people oppose each other. So what is right for Zeus may be wrong for Aphrodite. The only way that the gods could have imposed an absolute divine morality would be if all the gods in the Greek pantheon unanimously agreed on what was good. So this is where he differs with Euthyphro. So Euthyphro says that pious acts are those that please the gods, right? And so doing something bad angers the gods, right? And Socrates says that doing what is good because it's inherently good, but not in regard to the gods' authority because the gods fought against each other. So Islam and Christianity have a better case at pointing to a god with absolute morality and absolute as a source of absolute truth, because in Islam and Judaism and Christianity there's one God, right? While the Greek gods were many and they fought against each other. So their divine authority, Socrates says, is less, and so he's more appealing to the goodness of the acts themselves. So when we look at Plato's arguments in the Republic and the Euthyphro, we see that justice, in his view, is when everyone in the city does well and does not interfere with each other. This image applies to the individual, in which a just person does not let his lusting side conquer his reasoning. The gods do not define what is right, as we just saw. An action that creates harmony in a city or within oneself is what is right. So whatever leads to harmony in oneself or with others, right? Of course, Plato here assumes that order is the best or most just option in all cases. Many might disagree, arguing that sometimes people should not be, quote, stuck in their roles, but must be able to change the status quo, right? So, for example, this kind of flies in the face of what we now see as ethical, right? We see the ending of slavery or the abolition of slavery as an ethical thing, right? Or the increased rights of women to vote, for example. We see that as an ethical thing. Most people would not disagree with those things. Or most people would not disagree with abolition and suffrage for women, right? But maybe Plato here assumes that order is the best or the most just option, right? But if we But if the status quo allows slavery, or if the status quo allows or forbids women from voting, Plato might, I don't know what he would think about that. I haven't read Plato enough to really see. I'm sure he's talked about slavery, but, so this is where many people might disagree that harmony is not always the best option. There's something that you see in religious circles sometimes, unity, just have unity. But many other religious people will say, yes, unity, but not at the expense of absolute truth, right? So that's where that is. But in any case, so Plato and Socrates assume that order is the best thing. It's the most just thing. Whatever leads to harmony within oneself or around a community, that is what is just. That is what is ethical. So now, let's go to Emmanuel Kant. So his answer to the question, what determines right actions? It has some similarities to Plato's. So Kant wants us to believe in universal practical laws determined through reason. Such universal laws are so-called a priori, absolute and determinable apart from the use of human psychology. To be moral, every rational being must obey these, quote, universal rules. So one can see similarities here to Euthyphro's definition of piety, or actions that all the gods find pleasing, right? So Euthyphro and Kant are kind of appealing to an obedience of universal rules of morality. However, Kant does not stop there. He continues with the concept of a, quote, good will. Good intentions from a, quote, good heart are essential. Courage, riches, and other things are not good enough. They can actually be dangerous if not accompanied by a good will to guide them toward right action. Such a disposition towards goodness is good in itself, but this is more than just a mere wish to do right. It is instead a, quote, summoning of all means in our power. Good will without action is dead will. In determining righteousness, an active goodwill is the, quote, condition of everything else. So the will, Kant says, is the, quote, faculty of determining itself to action in accordance with the conception of certain laws. But how does one develop a good will? Kant again tells us to use reason. Reasoning beings are persons, not animals or things. This is where the basis of universal moral law is found, in the inherent value of reasoning beings, persons. And only rational beings have will. Because every person is reasoning and objectively valuable, it is thus possible to arrive at universal objective laws, or laws of the will, he says. Through reason, it is possible to develop a good will that leads to objective, universally acceptable moral behavior. Whew. To illustrate the role of will, or intention, some might say, Kant mentions a hypothetical jaded person who is primarily concerned about himself. Such a person may be still kind due to an ingrained nature, or maybe habit, or maybe culture. But this would not give him moral credit, says Kant, because it is almost like an irrational instinct, right? A dog wags his tail when it's happy, but that's out of instinct. Only if this person wants to show kindness from the will, from the heart, would kindness give this man moral credit. One must also not do moral things just for the reason of trying to avoid punishment. Aside from reason and will, Kant suggests that duty determines right action. This sense of obligation implies that something must be done, an action by a good will rather than by an inclination, habit, or nature. He points to the biblical command to love one's enemies. Humans are not inclined to obey this. This is not really a rational decision, but duty, however, can motivate one to love one's enemies regardless of an inclination or a rationality to hate them. Reason, therefore, must push our will to fulfill the duty of following universal moral law that applies to everyone. This is because rational beings use law. Because people are rational beings, moral laws arrived at by reason apply to everyone. For instance, it is bad for anyone to falsely promise. It's not okay for me to falsely promise, and then it's bad when my friend gives me a false promise. That's not projection. I'm just giving an example. It is considered not only wrong, but also unreasonable, so to speak, to destroy such moral rules to which every reasonable being should adhere. Rejecting utilitarianism, Kant believes that only volition, or will, makes one moral, not results. This is because an action's effects can be brought about via actions or means. For example, a poor person can become rich through work, or he can become a very successful thief. Morality thus does not lie in intended or actual results, but rather in an actor's or a person's goodwill and choices. Remember, there's a famous quote, "The road to hell is paved with well-intended results or good intentions." Only a good will, influenced by moral duty, Kant says, can lead to the highest good. Now, let us look at how Kant makes these elements. So we've looked at his arguments for reason, duty, and will to act together. Let's see how they act together. Reason creates a sense of natural, universal moral law. This stirs up a sense of duty, which in turn influences goodwill. It is this goodwill that, quote, transcends everything. In Kant's words, act only according to the maxim, or subjective or individual acting principle, by which you can arrive at the same will, decide, and then act, that it should become a universal law, objective, absolute truths. So this is why Kant says it is unreasonable to disobey universal rules of morality. We will consider another hypothetical person to illustrate this. Kant tells of a person indifferent to others' suffering. Such a one could reason that he need not help others. Kant concedes that this thinking may be advantageous because it will allow this person to keep more resources for himself. This evolutionary idea for the survival of the species, survival of the fittest. However, this law that this person has conjured up faces a counterexample. What about when he needs love and help from others? Thus, this man's own rules cannot be applied universally. Such a law is thus unreasonable, so it cannot properly guide one's moral actions. So, of course, Kant here is simply assuming that there is an actual moral universal principle of law. That is an argument for another time. But in one way, Kant is assuming that law, which in turn implies a simple system of rules, would be there to regulate human behavior. This makes his view somewhat like that of Plato, who saw harmony as the result of moral action. And by the way, I didn't mention what work Emmanuel Kant was writing here. The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. So, after analyzing Plato and Kant's answers to the question of what determines morality, let us categorize them. Are their ethics deontological, virtue-based, or utilitarian? Let's start with Kant, for he is the easiest to categorize. Kant shows a strong deontological bend. The word deontological refers to something done from or related to duty, which Kant explicitly names as a core part of how a moral action is determined. His fellow deontologists also find it unreasonable for someone to go against the universal laws of morality. So why go against something that's universal? As stated, Kant is not utilitarian, for he rejects an action's result as a determiner of that action's moral value. It is active goodwill guided by reason that makes something moral, and again, a sense of duty. So he is deontological. Plato's views are harder to place. Like Kant, he does appeal to reason. However, unlike Kant, he rejects universal laws given from above. Kant would also likely reject Plato's assertion that one must simply work well within one's lot in life, not interfering with those in other circumstances, right? Remember, Plato said, mind your own business. But Kant would likely want us to love our neighbors because through reason we can universally apply that to everyone. And also, while Plato does say that justice does create harmony, his ethics are not primarily concerned with results. He simply wants people to live well, leaving others in peace. He also says that those who overcome their unreasoning sides through reasons are just people, while the unjust have not conquered their passions. Plato believes that morality comes from within a person, if that person is just. Since he appeals to the inner parts of a person, we may put him down as a virtue ethicist, because virtue ethics primarily thinks about one's character, not so much one's circumstances. Well, that's it for today. So I hope you enjoyed that short comparison between Immanuel Kant and Plato's versions of ethics. What makes a moral person? Have a great day. God bless and take care.